Thank you for tuning in to the Israel Podcast, Episode 5, The Dreyfus Affair, Part 1. This is going to be the first of probably 4 or 5 episodes about the Dreyfus Affair. The affair is one of the most infamous affairs of the 20th century. It was a pivotal moment that shaped the political landscape of modern France and also led to the founding of the State of Israel. There are probably hundreds of books written on the events surrounding Captain Alfred Dreyfus's arrest for the crime of high treason in 1894 and the antisemitism unleashed against the Jewish quote-unquote traitor. I will base most of the content for the series of episodes on a book by Michael Burns, Dreyfus, A Family Affair. I will leave a link in the show notes, and I urge you to get a copy and read it. To get a better understanding of the story, let's start at the beginning with the Dreyfus family and their home in a small village near the River Rhine on the eve of the French Revolution. This is where it all began. Abraham Israel Dreyfus was born in the village of Rixheim in 1749, some 30 kilometers north of the Swiss city of Basel. During Abraham's youth, 1,500 Christians shared the village with 200 Jews. The village, a stronghold of the militant Catholic Teutonic Order, was home to Jewish families that could trace back their origins to the Roman Empire. Abraham's ancestors were some of the earliest to settle in the area, their name originating from a Roman encampment using the words dry and fus to approximate the original Latin sound. Bordered by the Vosges Mountains to the west and the Rhine to the east, this area had passed from Habsburg rule to French control following the 30 Years' War. Unlike shtetls in Eastern Europe, Rixheim had no clear areas of Jewish quarantine. This allowed for interaction between Jews and Christians that kept rigid barriers of division from forming. Abraham, like all Jews, was forbidden by royal decree and local norms from owning land, so he made a living as a butcher. He provided kosher meat to the Jewish community and sold the hindquarters and other non-kosher parts to Christian villagers. 30 years old in 1779, Abraham met Brendel Meyer, daughter of Jacob, from the Black Forest village of Mülheim, 10 kilometers east across the Rhine. The Rhine marked the border between French Alsace and the Germanic Duchy of Baden since the 30 Years' War. But borders set by kings meant nothing to peasants, peddlers, and young people in love at the time. Abraham, a French subject, and Brendel, a German subject, were raised more or less in identical worlds, and they spoke the same language, a Judeo-Alsatian dialect that mixed Hebrew, German, and a little bit of French. Rixheim itself was a cacophony of languages, German words, French phrases, Hebrew expressions, and local dialects. One British traveler who visited the area at the time found only a few locals who knew French, some who spoke German, and a vast majority who communicated in bizarre, incomprehensible dialects. Barely half a dozen villagers at the time could read or write French. Jacob Dreyfus was born in 1781 and named after Brendel's father, keeping with Jewish Ashkenazi tradition. Jacob set out at an early age to peddle secondhand goods on the country roads and market fairs of the region. As late as 1812, when Jacob was already 31, French officials were still complaining that only 20% of the teachers in Alsace could give lessons in French, and less than 10% could do so effectively. The family remained untypically small for the time. Abraham and Brendel had only one other child, a daughter that died in infancy. Like other merchants and traders of the time, Abraham lent money to local peasants for the purchase of seeds, of livestock, farm tools, and small plots of land. Christian lenders in Rixheim were just as numerous as Jewish ones. And as the only sources of credit at the time, local lenders helped neighbors who always had a need for seasonal cash. This informal financial system helped farmers get seeds in and crops out and served day laborers and widows who had fallen on hard times. Well-made loans benefited lenders and clients alike, but when natural disasters or simply hard weather hit, the repayment of a loan was easily jeopardized. At least 5 major agricultural crises had struck the region during that time, pushing death rates up along with the price of grain. One of the worst came between 1788 and 1789. During those years, royal officials repeated complaints that southern Alsace had become a center of usury. Although reality on the ground was complex, complaints were not, and they focused on the Jews. Some reports by these royal officials called for tighter restrictions on Jewish migration and marriage, and others insisted on mass expulsion of the Jews as the only solution, while royal officials drafted reports and official grievances. Local peasants vented their anger in other ways. In late July, peasant gangs gathered demanding an end to their debts and threatening the lives and property of their lenders. They first attacked priests and taxmen, and then they turned on the Jews. Hearing reports of violence nearby, Rixheim's Jews quickly took refuge in the Swiss town of Basel or in the small republic of Mulhausen to the west. In their absence, everything left behind was either looted or completely destroyed. Royal troops stationed along the eastern frontier tried to maintain order. But the riots gradually became part of a larger rebellion that even the king's men could no longer control. The French Revolution has begun. The revolutionaries and the new architects of the nation needed to form a single community and to make Frenchmen of Bretons, Basques, and other minorities. The National Assembly treated the Jewish question as a minor issue in the far, far greater endeavor of national unification. Debate over full Jewish emancipation carried on, and it sounded something like this. Let us begin by destroying all the humiliating signs which designate them as Jews, so that their garb, their outward appearance, show us that they are fellow citizens. Let us restore them to happiness by restoring them to the dignity of human beings and of citizens, added Maximilien de Robespierre. Deny them everything as a nation, proclaimed another supporter of emancipation, and grant them everything as individuals. If they resist, he added, expel them. On September 27th, 1791, the French Assembly voted by an overwhelming margin for the emancipation of the Jews of Alsace and the neighboring province of Lorraine. All restrictions on Jews would be abolished. Every French Jew who swears the oath of citizenship and fulfills all the duties that the Constitution imposes will have the right to all of its benefits. For the first time, the basic rights of civil equality were extended to all Jews in French territory. Everywhere else in the world, Jews remained a nation apart, tolerated by some, prosecuted by others, but denied citizenship by all. The oath of citizenship the Jews took en masse did nothing to spare them the effects of the impending conflict, however. Alsatian peasants retraced their steps through the Rhine Valley villages in the spring of 1790 and in the autumn of 1791. And again, forced Rixheim's Jews to gather their meager possessions and take refuge in Mulhausen or in Basel. A few years later, after 1792, the Dreyfus family would watch the Alsatian countryside become the eastern battleground on which revolutionary soldiers of the new French regime confronted the troops of Austria and Prussia. At the same time, Rixheim and its surroundings became the refuge for Central and Eastern European Jews fleeing persecution in their own homelands. They came from villages and towns beyond the Rhine, and their presence added to the suspicions of a population that made very few distinctions between French and foreign Jews. And they felt the worst impact of that terror when peasants turned on Jewish families in the winter of 1793 and 94. The same villages that had been plundered in 1789 had their synagogues and cemeteries vandalized. And at the height of the rebellion, for the third time in 5 years, local Jews had to flee again to Mulhausen and Basel. The revolutionary regime faced a choice. It could join the local population by punishing or expelling the Jews, or it could honor its own promises and protect its Jewish citizens from the rioting peasants. A detachment of troops was sent to intervene and put an end to the violence, and possibly, for the first time in Europe, Jews welcomed and benefited from the state's protection. The first fulfillment of a revolutionary promise. And at the same time, French officials made good on yet another promise. As a longtime resident of Alsace, Abraham Dreyfus was now permitted to own his own house. Furthermore, city gates were now open to Jews. The emancipation abolished body tolls levied on Jews entering towns and did away with tickets of protection that Abraham Dreyfus would have paid officials of the old regime. Abraham's son Jacob could now travel throughout Alsace to sell his merchandise, and he would not be chased out of the city when the church bells tolled at sundown. 24 years old, when his mother died, Jacob stayed with Abraham and worked as a dealer, a trade that usually included week-long trips to sell second-hand goods in outlying farmsteads and towns. On Sunday mornings, after spending Sabbath with his father, he would set off walking stick in hand, living on black bread and water, and bought and sold old clothes, small pieces of furniture, tools, and trinkets, and sleeping by the roadside or in the homes of other Jewish families. These peddlers formed a logistical backbone between country and town in the years before railroads came to the continent. Jacob soon added part-time money lending to his second-hand trade and invested in small parcels of land. Only a few years after his father had been permitted to own land, Jacob was already paying property taxes on plots near the family home, and later on other holdings in Rixheim. At the age of 32, he married his neighbor, Rachel Katz, and brought her to live in the same house with his father. In 1813, Russian and Austrian soldiers returned to the Rhine Valley on their march toward Mulhausen and the French interior. Revolutionary wars had given way to Napoleonic campaigns, and after a decade of victories that pushed the emperor's troops deep into Europe, France's enemies were now pushing back. After 1815, with Allied powers gathering in Vienna to save Europe from future Napoleons, and with Austrian troops still in Alsace, a fragile peace held through the years when Rachel and Jacob began to raise a family. Their first child died in infancy, and 3 years later, a son they named Joseph also died days after birth. Only their third child, born on May 12, 1818, survived. They named him Raphael, after the angel who visited the biblical Abraham and whose name means God's healing. When the last of the Austrians left the region in 1818 and Napoleon's decrees expired, country people suffering the catastrophe of recent crop failures renewed their demands for the massive deportation of Jews as the only solution to the problem of usury. In the fall of 1819, police reported that Jews sought protection after being attacked by rioting gangs. From Paris, the Minister of the Interior instructed the police to protect Jews and restore order. A few years later, on a festival day in 1823 near Rixheim, drunk peasants marched to the homes of their moneylenders, pushed through doorways, demanded an end to their debts, and threatened Jews that they would exterminate them all. Gangs in Zilsheim, barely 10 kilometers from Rixheim, plundered the synagogue and pushed Jews into the river. The main road out of Rixheim led west to Mulhausen. On trips with his father Jacob, young Raphael passed the mill houses that had given the town its name centuries before. By the 1830s, however, as rural laborers abandoned fields and vineyards and moved to the city, these mill houses became artifacts of a bygone age. Cotton spinning and weaving enterprises had been established in Mulhausen by 1760. And over the next 2 generations, mechanized factories eclipsed the small-scale production of leather and woolen goods and printed cloth. In the days of this industrial revolution, workers migrated to new steam-powered textile factories, and the road from Rixheim expanded with the industrializing landscape of Alsace. In a few years, the city's commerce had reached out and surrounded Rixheim itself and threatened the livelihood of Jacob as an intermediary between country and town, a service the Jews had provided since the Roman era and that Jacob had taught his son. Mulhausen industrialists now chose Rixheim, only 5 kilometers to the east, as a prime center for future development. The Zuber factory now became the dominant local enterprise, and though small tile and plaster industries remained and Jews still peddled livestock and loans, the small village of Jacob's youth had changed dramatically. Zuber's factory employed scores of Rixheim residents and supported many more. But the enterprise had a particular profile. When company officials recorded the religious affiliations of the workers, they listed 232 Catholics, 9 Protestants, and 0 Jews. Rixheim's 2 communities had been driven apart by years of conflict and by a radical transformation of the local economy that had left very little room for the Jews. Watching Rixheim change and Mulhausen grow, Jacob realized that city commerce also promised opportunities. And in the early 1830s, Jacob took his savings from peddling, moneylending, and renting small pieces of land and purchased a small apartment on a Mulhausen street with a French name. The Rue de la Justice was a promising place for a new beginning. A place of refuge remembered by Rixheim's Jews, Mulhausen had also become a center of French and Protestant culture in a Germanic and Catholic Alsace. In 1798, the town had proclaimed the allegiance of their 600-year-old republic to the French nation. Many of the city's squares, monuments, and streets took on new names in celebration of the union with France. Schindergasse was renamed to Rue de la Justice. 50 cannon blasts opened the festivities at dawn on March 15th, 1798. And after children presented French officials with a key to the town on a silver platter, they moved on to the city gates and planted liberty trees, symbols of the revolution. Crowds gathered to hear the Treaty of Union proclaimed in both French and German. Drinking and dancing followed, along with the singing of a special version of the Marseillaise translated into German, although most locals could barely understand the words of both versions. 40 years after this celebration, Jacob, Rachel, and Raphael Dreyfus came to Rue de la Justice. The Jewish community in the city now approached 1,200. A new synagogue had been built on the site of an old hospital in 1822, and 9 years later, Mulhausen's rabbi was the first Jew to be buried within city limits. Jacob abandoned his money-lending practice. He and Raphael became merchants. On the evening of May 27th, 1838, less than 3 years after settling in Mulhausen, Jacob died in the apartment on the Rue de la Justice. He was 57 years old, and he was the first member of the Dreyfus family to be buried in a city as a citizen. In the spring of 1841, Raphael married Jeannette. Joining Rachel Dreyfus in the apartment on the Rue de la Justice, Jeannette worked as a seamstress, while Raphael continued his merchant trade. The young couple named their first son, born in 1844, after his grandfather. But a simple difference signaled a big change. While Jacob Dreyfus had kept the biblical form of his name, Raphael and Jeannette named their son Jacques. Jacques grew up in a city that changed more during his childhood than it had in 6 centuries. New cotton, wool, chemical, and machine factories, wider and deeper canal networks, and new railroads that linked Mulhausen to nearby industrial centers and to the major cities of Switzerland, Alsace, and the French interior. The journey to Strasbourg, which had taken 6 days in 1600 and nearly 2 days in 1800, took only 2 hours in 1841 and in relative comfort. While Jacob Dreyfus had come to a town of 13,000, his grandson Jacques was born in a city of 30,000. And within a few years, the population approached 100,000. On the 50th anniversary of the Treaty of Union, Mulhausen town leaders reconfirmed their ties to France by officially abandoning the Germanic spelling of their former republic for the French Mulhouse. With Raphael's merchant trade expanding along with the town's commerce, Jeannette left her seamstress job to care for their 5 children. A cholera epidemic claimed 2 of her daughters. But in October 1854, Jeannette gave birth to a second son, Léon, and the family numbered 6. Mulhouse entered a period of industrial expansion that secured its reputation as the principal textile center of the region. For the first time, local enterprises seriously challenged their English counterparts. And Mulhouse became what some people called the Manchester of the continent. When Jacob Dreyfus moved to Mulhausen, 6,000 mechanized looms were installed in factories throughout Alsace. But by 1850, there were more than 15,000, and Mulhouse had the greatest share. At the age of 32 in 1850, Raphael began work as an agent, dealing in printed and embroidered fabrics. He is specialized in the colorful, elegant fabrics that, since the 18th century, had draped the furniture, covered the salon walls, and made up the wardrobes of the European aristocracy and bourgeoisie. A clientele from Vienna to St. Petersburg whose taste in language, dress, and decor were distinctly French. 4 decades after his father purchased his first parcels of land in Rixheim, Raphael began to buy property in Mulhouse. Fierce competition in the town led to failure as well as fortune during those years. The pages of a local newspaper, the Industriel Alsacien, ran constant announcements of bankruptcies and foreclosures. Raphael's income was still to be made, and the source of his good fortune lay in London, Paris, and the American South. With the closing of American ports during the Civil War, a cotton famine hit textile centers in Lancashire and Normandy, and then spread across Europe. Although Mulhouse had more reserve stock than did most port cities, after 1861, the Industriel Alsacien became more of an obituary sheet than a newspaper. Businesses throughout the region succumbed to the double pressure of cotton shortages and stiff competition from the rest of Europe. As prices rose, however, so did the profits of agents who had no raw materials to buy, no equipment to maintain, no mortgages to meet, and no workers to pay. Hard times were the best of times for Raphael Dreyfus. In 1862, at the height of the cotton crisis, Raphael set up his own cotton mill. Grandson of a butcher and son of a peddler who sold second-hand goods along country roads, Raphael began construction of a large factory the year he turned 44. Although Mulhouse Protestants made room for self-made men, the textile world kept partly open to Jews, but completely closed to Catholics. Unable to penetrate that industrial establishment, Catholic immigrants still came by the thousands to work in cotton, wool, chemical, and machine factories. During Raphael's early years in Mulhouse, Catholics and Protestants had been almost equal in number. But by the 1860s, nearly 45,000 Catholics lived among 15,000 Protestants and fewer than 2,000 Jews. These men, women, and children, poor and barely literate, clinging to Germanic dialects, provided the labor for the local industrial revolution. The Dreyfus apartment was now a crowded home for a family of 9. After Jacques, Henriette, Louise, and Léon came Rachel and Mathieu. Jeanette's last child, born on October 9, 1859, when she was 42 years old, was named Alfred. By 1865, Raphael, Jeanette, and their 7 children, from 6-year-old Alfred to 21-year-old Jacques, made up a family of many accents and languages. With German-speaking parents, all the children would eventually perfect their French. But only the last 2 boys, Mathieu and Alfred, were young enough to make it their mother tongue. France had declared war on Germany 30 times over the 2 centuries prior to 1870. Bismarck, wary of his neighbor, wanted, quote-unquote, land, fortresses, and frontiers, which will shelter us for good from enemy attack. And after defeating the Austrians in 1866, he turned his attention to France. On July 15th, with Parisian crowds shouting, "To the Rhine!" and singing the Marseillaise, and with recruits scrambling to join units throughout France, the emperor's government was pushing for a war. A formal declaration came 4 days later. The quick strike by French troops across the Rhine never materialized. Instead, German soldiers swept into French territory north of Strasbourg, while more than half of French reservists had not even reached their regiments. The French general Ducrot probably described it best. Quote, "We are in a chamber pot, and we will be shat on." End quote. At 9 o'clock on the morning of September 16th, on the same balcony from which Alfred had watched French cavalry ride off to face the Germans, he now saw 5,000 German troops enter Mulhouse. The defeat was rapid and humiliating. A few days later, German troops surrounded Paris. The German troops stayed in Mulhouse only for a day, but they left a sign of things to come. They destroyed a major railroad bridge and cut town industries off from markets and sources of fuel and raw materials. The Germans began the systematic severing of the population from the French interior. Young Alfred's reaction to the arrival of the German troops, quote, "My hatred, the hatred of my family for the foreigners," as he described it later, was of fear and anger, but also of patriotism. On October 9th, Alfred Dreyfus's 11th birthday, Germans threatened to lay waste to Mulhouse if demands for money and materiel were not met. City leaders rushed to provide 60 wagons, 160 horses, 6,000 flannel shirts, 1,000 loaves of bread, 18,000 cigars, 375 kilograms of tobacco, 1,500 bottles of wine, and nearly 50,000 francs in cash. Then, to confirm their true allegiance, they quietly sent supplies of the same value to the French army at Belfort. Jacques Dreyfus, left the industrial front to his father and 16-year-old brother Léon enjoyed the Légion des Alsace-Lorraine. The Prussians tried to stop the flight of young men from the eastern provinces to French recruitment centers. But Jacques Dreyfus, just turned 26 years old, found a way to volunteer. He was the first of his family to join the French army, but not the last. Where occupiers threatened residents with fines and imprisonment for simply showing the French flag, Jacques' actions placed his family in danger. On January 23, 1871, a general alarm in Mulhouse called citizens to the Place de la Paix. The crowd learned that King Wilhelm of Prussia had been proclaimed Emperor of Germany. Wilhelm's ceremony had taken place 5 days before. But not in Berlin, in Versailles. On March 2nd, in a move that shocked French Alsatians who had sent their sons to war, the French Assembly ratified the preliminaries of peace and voted to turn all of Alsace and parts of Lorraine over to the Germans. The Treaty of Frankfurt severed the eastern provinces from France. And on May 21st, 1871, Raphael and Jeannette Dreyfus and their 7 children became colonial subjects of a German Reichsland. The German state announced its intention to draft all boys into the military. Although veterans like Jacques Dreyfus would be exempted, in a few years, Léon, Mathieu, and Alfred would be pressed into the German army. The prospect of serving in the enemy army hastened the family's search for a way out. Raphael asked his oldest son to stay and salvage the family business and prepared to move the rest of the family to Basel. Separated from his home and his mother for the first time, 13-year-old Alfred spent a depressing autumn and winter in a Basel secondary school. The institution offered some courses in French, but the primary language was German. Early in 1873, with their parents, sisters, and elder brothers remaining behind either in Mulhouse or in Basel, Mathieu and Alfred, the 2 youngest boys, set off for Paris. After a brief time at the Collège Sainte-Barbe in Paris, close to the Panthéon and among France's most prestigious secondary schools, Alfred followed Mathieu and transferred to the Collège Chaptal, another school known for rigorous standards and catered, as one school history put it, to the elite of the elite. Mathieu, at 18, volunteered for the French army. Able to afford the expenses and convinced that all Alsatians had a moral obligation to serve France, he joined the 9th Regiment of Hussars in Belfort. Completing his studies in Paris in July 1875, Alfred considered the prospect of the baccalaureate, the French diploma. The arduous written and oral examinations were difficult, the failure rate staggering, and the entire process was quite terrifying for those few students that were awarded the degree. But with passing marks and an additional year or 2 of intensive study, Alfred would be eligible to apply to one of the Parisian Grandes Écoles, schools that prepared a select group of young men for leadership in industry and the military. At least half of the students failed the exams for the baccalaureate, but Alfred passed both parts. He then moved on to the even more torturous phase of preparatory school. He attended Sainte-Barbe, a college that offered 2- and 3-year programs for advanced students, planning to take the entrance exam required by the École Polytechnique, the École Normale Supérieure, and other Grandes Écoles. Alfred studied through the winter of 1876 and 1877 and into the early spring. He had a keen intellect, a gift for languages, and a fascination with mathematics, science, and philosophy. Very few young men and virtually no women had the opportunity to secure an education like Alfred Dreyfus. His brothers urged him to keep the family business as his goal, but Alfred prepared for a military career. For a boy of 18, the army promised action, excitement, mobility, and, no less important for the last of 7 children, a chance to stand out. No young recruit would be more proud of his uniform than Alfred Dreyfus. When 19-year-old Alfred arrived at the gates of the École Polytechnique in November of 1878, a new French Republic was rushing to rebuild an officer corps humiliated by the defeat of 1870. Alfred Dreyfus and his young comrades were taught to respect the established order. The school tolerated diverse faiths and liberty of conscience, but Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and free-thinking students quickly learned that duty, loyalty, and conformity must supersede all quote-unquote personal interests. Students at the school were taught advanced geometry, algebra, calculus, physics, chemistry, and applied mechanics. By the late 1870s, new emphasis had also been placed on modern languages. German was required, Russian offered, and on French literature and history. The aim was to achieve encyclopedic knowledge. Alfred Dreyfus graduated 128th in his class in 1880 and was designated as a second lieutenant. The regime of military life, the marching drills, gymnastics, and fencing changed him from a timid recruit to a strong, self-confident officer. Artillery was the dynamic center of the new French army, and since the early 1870s, efforts had been made to bring its officer corps up to full strength. It needed men from the École Polytechnique, and Alfred chose artillery as his career. Grandson of a peddler who had traveled country roads walking stick in hand, Second Lieutenant Alfred Dreyfus set off on his own nomadic journey through French garrisons. The Dreyfus Mill in Mulhouse remained an independent family firm, and thanks largely to Jacques, it entered a new phase of expansion. Profit from the family's business and property holdings provided substantial income for each of the 4 sons. At a time when minor functionaries earned little more than 2,000 francs a year, and when a second lieutenant's salary was even less, Alfred's income was several times more than that. Alfred Dreyfus was very much an exception, and by some, very much resented. Alfred traveled to the forests of Fontainebleau and the École d'Application de l'Artillerie, from which in 1882 he graduated 32nd out of 97 students and showed promise that he would become a good officer. He served in the 31st Artillery Regiment until he moved on to a cavalry division of the same regiment. Intelligent, conscientious, and zealous, according to his superiors. In 1885, commanding officers approved his promotion to first lieutenant as he earned praise as an intrepid horseman. Commanding officers filed enthusiastic reports on Lieutenant Dreyfus. He exhibited a very lively intelligence and an excellent memory, according to his commanders. Full of spirit and extremely qualified to teach horsemanship to squadrons in Paris, he was an ideal candidate for the École Supérieure de Guerre. That school, not yet a decade old, had been established to prepare staff officers who could work closely with unit commanders, or in the case of top graduates, with the Army General Staff. This new school provided an avenue of promotion for the Army's most gifted soldiers. And for a young man of Alfred's temperament, ambition, and skills, it was the logical next step. In late summer of 1889, Dreyfus began to study for the competitive entrance exams to the École de Guerre. He was promoted to captain in September 1889, a few weeks short of his 30th birthday. Alfred's comrade had introduced him to a family of considerable note and to a young woman named Lucy, who would become his wife. The captain enjoyed a substantial private income, but Lucy's fortune, estimated at nearly 3 million francs, promised even greater wealth. He would be married by France's Grand Rabbi. In the spring, Captain Dreyfus took the examination of the École de Guerre, a 3-day marathon of military tactics, topography, history, and German, and he was one of the few artillery candidates to pass. He was now destined to enter the ranks of the Army High Command. Many of those high-ranking officers, however, believed that France needed defending not only from Germans, but from forces within, from Protestants, Freemasons, and of course, Jews. Entering the École de Guerre, an unimpressive 67th out of 81 officers, Dreyfus soon attracted the attention of his superiors, much as he had done before in the garrisons. He started slowly, but worked hard and advanced quickly. His assignments included trips to examine frontier fortresses and transportation networks west of the Vosges and south towards the Alps. The defeat of 1870 had been due in part to a lack of adequate maps, and Dreyfus could now apply his knowledge of the eastern provinces to topographical studies and land surveys. Assessing the capability of rail lines to move troops and materiel across northeastern France towards Verdun and deep into the Argonne forest, Dreyfus and his fellow officers mapped out possible scenarios in the event of renewed conflict with the Germans. General de Dion, commandant of the École de Guerre, noted Dreyfus's mastery of military theory and administrative practice, his good education, work habits, and quick intelligence, and his very good conduct. Horsemanship and knowledge of German were also cited as outstanding qualities. His superiors continued to believe that he would make a fine officer. To secure a place on the general staff, École de Guerre graduates had to rank near the top of their class. And by the summer of 1892, Dreyfus was optimistic that he would emerge with high ranks, maybe even the top 10. Before returning to Paris, he visited his father and brothers in Mulhouse. It was his second trip east in 2 years, and he followed the example of other French Alsatians who crossed the border without passports. Since 1884, Dreyfus had submitted official requests to visit Mulhouse on at least 10 occasions. Most had been refused. Now a veteran traveler, impatient with bureaucracy and aware that the frontier authorities just closed their eyes, he paid another unofficial visit to his family home. In November, he learned the results of the École de Guerre. He ranked 9th out of 81. It was a remarkable accomplishment, and it made him eligible for a position as a stagiaire on the Army General Staff. Before taking up his new post, however, he lodged a protest with the commanding officer of the École de Guerre. He had learned during the summer that a member of the examination jury, General Pierre Bonfons, did not, and I quote, want a Jew on the general staff. Waiting until November and the announcement of his score, even with Bonfons' critique he had done brilliantly, he demanded a meeting with General Leblanc de Dion. Is a Jewish officer not capable, Dreyfus asked, of serving his country as well as any other soldier? Assured by the general that the army never made distinctions based on religious faith and that Jewish officers were valued as highly as any others, he emerged from that meeting and from another with an École de Guerre colonel, satisfied that his superiors respected his accomplishments. Dreyfus believed that the fundamentals, that merit led to promotion, and that duty to the nation superseded all personal interests, were honored at the highest levels of the military. Bonfond, Dreyfus believed, was an exception to the army's rule of justice. Bonfond's attack and Dreyfus's response, however, were parts of a much larger chain of events. In April 1892, Edouard Adolphe Drumont, the founder of the Ligue Antisémitique de France, launched a newspaper called La Libre Parole, which aimed to promote through its quote-unquote free speech anti-Semitism. Following Drumont's book, published in 1886 and selling 100,000 copies in the first year, the newspaper summarized for popular consumption the so-called long, corrosive history of the Jews and the crimes of the sons of Abraham. Drumont played on fears that came with rapid economic change, and he knew very well how to turn repeated lies into well-received ideas. One contemporary summed it up nicely. If the railroad runs efficiently, it's called the Compagnie du Nord. If it runs poorly, it's called the Compagnie Rothschild. And when things go wrong, it becomes the railroad of the Jew Rothschild. By the early 1890s, Drumont was not alone, and a wide range of broadsheets, books, and newspapers echoed his anti-Semitic attacks throughout France. At the time, the number of Jews in uniform was much higher in proportion to the number of Jews in the general population. Drumont saw that as evidence for infiltration, not patriotism, and he exaggerated Jewish influence in the army. With no way to confirm the lies and no desire to do so, the vast majority of Drumont's followers believed what they read. And through the summer of 1892, they read about the inability of the military high command to root out its Jews. In the meantime, Alfred and Lucie Dreyfus celebrated the birth of their first child, Pierre Léon, on April 5th, 1891. 2 years later, on February 22, 1893, only weeks after Alfred began work on the general staff, a daughter was born and named Jean, after Alfred's mother. The couple's combined private income helped them furnish a high-end apartment in Paris, pay for servants, and acquire an extensive wardrobe for city and country. Alfred had a wine cellar built for the apartment. He ordered specially tailored uniforms and indulged his taste for chocolates and small cigars. And at the age of 34, maintained the life of a rich and gifted officer in a nation at peace. From his school years in Paris through his work on the general staff, he impressed colleagues as a proud but distant man who kept himself under tight rein. For more than a dozen years, Alfred passed every test that Paris and the army had set before him. Dreyfus's professional zeal and personal pride elicited both admiration and hostility on the general staff. As he passed through its 4 sections and learned, along with 12 other stagiaires, the details of fortifications, artillery strategy, troop movements, and intelligence, he continued to win the praise he had known throughout his career. A very intelligent officer with extensive knowledge, wrote one colonel in the fall of 1893. He wants and should succeed. But alongside high marks for his gifted and quick mind and his language skills, there appeared, for only the second time in his career, criticisms of his pretentiousness. And as Colonel Pierre Fabre of General Staff put it, problems with his character. He was ambitious and perhaps too sure of himself. The language was reminiscent of Bonfon's earlier critique, and it revealed a desire on the part of some officers to rid the General Staff of its Jewish stagiaire. Many of his colleagues were avid readers of La Libre Parole, and Dreyfus was a target of envy. It hardly helped that most staff officers scraped on an annual salary, which barely matched a month of Alfred's private income. As he moved through the stages of the General Staff, he made no attempt to downplay his achievements, hide his wealth, hold back his opinions, or change his solitary work habits. He saw copies of La Libre Parole on the desks of some colleagues, but attached to them little importance. In early December 1893, Alfred received word that his father had fallen critically ill. Granted emergency leave from the War Ministry and a travel permit from the German embassy, Alfred rushed to Mulhouse and to Raphael's bedside. He had barely 2 days with his father, and on Wednesday, December 13th, surrounded for the first time in years by all of his children, Raphael died. He was 75 years old. In addition to irregular payments over recent years, each of the children now received an additional inheritance on Raphael's death. In 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus was back at work at the État Major, and in late June, he was encouraged by a meeting with the Army's new Chief of Staff. Dreyfus accompanied the new Chief of Staff on a trip to the town of Charmes, near the Vosges Mountains. At dinner, conversation turned to recent artillery tests conducted in Calais and Bourges, a subject Dreyfus knew very well. Given his good memory and interest in artillery modernization, the captain impressed his companions with his sophisticated analysis and mastery of detail. After dinner, the new Chief of Staff invited Dreyfus to join him for a walk. And for more than an hour, along the banks of the Moselle River, the Army Chief of Staff and the second-year stagiaire discussed military matters, while other officers trailed behind. Dreyfus returned from that trip with a renewed faith that the High Command valued his efforts. Several weeks later, on Wednesday, October 31st, 1894, Mathieu Dreyfus, Alfred's older brother, received an urgent telegram at the Mulhouse Cotton Exchange. He must come to Paris immediately. The message contained no details. Mathieu immediately took the night train and arrived at the Gare de l'Est before dawn the next morning. On the dimly lit platform, he saw his sister Rachel alone with Lucy. He feared the worst. I think this is a good place to stop. Thanks for listening and checking out the Israel podcast. I hope you tune in next time for another episode. We'll be going over Alfred's first trial and degradation.